My name is Celeste Hartwell, and 3 months ago, I watched my boss tell 37 people their jobs were gone because the company was broke while I sat there, knowing about the $12 million hidden in executive bonus accounts that nobody thought I could access. The moment he said, "Financial constraints force us to eliminate this entire department," I felt something break inside me, but not in the way you'd think. I didn't feel sad or scared. I felt this weird, calm wash over me because I realized they'd just made the biggest mistake of their professional lives. See, I'd been processing financial reports for 8 years, quietly moving numbers around while executives treated me like office equipment. And during those 8 years, I'd accidentally discovered something they'd forgotten I had clearance to see. When our department head finished his little speech about belt tightening and necessary sacrifices, I raised my hand and asked if I should mention the Executive Emergency Fund that had been collecting money from our department's budget for the past 4 years. You should have seen his face. Everyone in that room turned to look at me like I'd just announced I was an alien, and the room got so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Before I go deeper into what happened, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're listening from? Because I want to know where my story is reaching people around the world. And also, like, subscribe, and click the bell icon, because what I'm about to tell you is going to show you exactly how I turned their own system against them, and you're not going to believe how this ends. So let me back up just a little bit. I worked for this massive technology company that everyone's heard of, one of those places with fancy offices and free snacks and motivational posters everywhere about being a family. For 8 years, I sat in the same cubicle processing purchase orders, expense reports, and budget transfers. My job was basically to make sure money went where it was supposed to go, which sounds boring but actually gave me access to more financial information than most people realize. I was like a traffic controller for company money, watching millions of dollars flow through different accounts every single day. The thing about working in finance is that you start seeing patterns. You notice when money moves in weird ways, or when accounts get funded from strange sources. And about 4 years ago, I started noticing something that didn't make sense. Every quarter, our department's budget would get reduced by exactly $50,000, but the reduction never showed up anywhere in our actual spending. It was like the money just vanished into thin air. At first, I thought it was an accounting error, but when I dug deeper, I found something that made my blood run cold. There was this account called Executive Contingency Reserve that was being funded by tiny amounts skimmed from departments all across the company. A few thousand here, a few thousand there, never enough for any individual department to notice, but it all added up. And this account wasn't for emergencies or company improvements. It was a slush fund that got distributed as bonus payments to senior executives every December. While they were telling us to cut costs and be more efficient, they were literally stealing money from our budgets to pay themselves extra bonuses. I probably should have reported it right then, but honestly, I was scared. These people had the power to destroy my career with one phone call, and I needed this job. I had student loans and rent and all the normal stuff that keeps you trapped in a place even when you know something's wrong. So I kept quiet and just kept doing my job, watching them take our money year after year while lecturing us about fiscal responsibility. But then came the day that changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning in September, and our department head called an all-hands meeting. Everyone gathered in the main conference room, and you could tell from his expression that something was wrong. He looked nervous and kept checking his notes like he was afraid he'd forget his lines. Then he dropped the bomb. Due to severe financial constraints and the need for immediate cost reduction, the entire financial processing department was being eliminated effective immediately. 37 people, some who'd been with the company for over a decade, were getting laid off with 2 weeks severance and a promise that they'd get positive references. People started crying. This woman named Patricia, who sat next to me, had just bought a house 6 months earlier, and she started hyperventilating. This guy named Jerome, who'd worked there for 15 years, just put his head in his hands and stared at the table. Everyone was devastated, and our department head kept going on about how difficult this decision was and how much the company valued our contributions. But tough economic realities demanded tough choices. That's when I raised my hand. I don't know what came over me, but I couldn't sit there and listen to that garbage anymore. I said, very politely, "Before we accept our terminations, should I mention the Executive Contingency Reserve account that's been funded by transfers from our department budget for the past 4 years? Because I have the records showing approximately $12 million that's been distributed as bonuses while we're being told the company can't afford to keep us employed." The room went absolutely silent. Our department head's face turned this weird grayish color, and he started stammering about how that was confidential information and I shouldn't have access to those records. But here's the thing. I did have access because they'd never bothered to update my clearance levels. They thought I was just some quiet worker bee who moved numbers around without paying attention to what they meant. They were wrong. I pulled out my laptop and opened the file I'd been tracking for 4 years. $12.3 million, to be exact, skimmed from department budgets across the company and funneled into executive bonus payments. The same executives who are now claiming the company was in such dire financial straits that they needed to eliminate entire departments to survive. But here's where it gets interesting, and why I'm telling you this story. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't demand they reverse the layoffs or promise to expose them publicly. Instead, I did something they never saw coming. I smiled, closed my laptop, and said I understood their position completely. Then I mentioned that I'd be filing some paperwork with Human Resources before my departure, just to make sure everything was handled properly. What they didn't know was that during my 8 years of processing corporate policies and procedures, I'd discovered something buried deep in the employee handbook. There was this obscure provision called Emergency Financial Hardship Review that allowed employees facing termination due to company financial distress to request a comprehensive audit of company finances. The policy was probably written decades ago by some lawyer covering the company's liability, and it had never been used because most people don't know it exists. But I knew it existed, and I knew exactly how to trigger it. The provision stated that if any employee or group of employees faced termination specifically due to claimed financial hardship by the company, they had the right to request verification of that financial hardship through an independent review of all company financial records. The company then had 30 days to either prove genuine financial distress by opening their books to employee representatives or negotiate alternative compensation to avoid the audit. So I went straight to Human Resources and filed emergency financial hardship review requests on behalf of every single person who'd been laid off. 37 separate requests, all perfectly legal, all completely within company policy. Each request demanded either proof of genuine financial hardship or appropriate compensation for wrongful termination based on false financial claims. The beautiful part was that I'd structured the requests to require disclosure of all executive compensation, including bonuses, contingency funds, and discretionary spending. If they wanted to prove they were broke, they'd have to show every penny they'd been paying themselves while claiming poverty. And if they refused to open their books, they'd have to explain to 37 employees why they couldn't prove the financial distress they'd claimed as justification for mass layoffs. I submitted the paperwork on a Friday afternoon and went home for the weekend feeling calmer than I'd felt in years. I knew they'd spend the weekend scrambling to figure out their options, and I knew they weren't going to like any of them. Monday morning, I got a call from the company's head of legal, very polite, very professional, asking if I'd be available for a meeting to discuss my recent filings. I said absolutely, and suggested we include representatives for all the other affected employees since their cases were identical to mine. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday morning. I spent Tuesday evening preparing a simple presentation outlining the legal requirements of the Emergency Financial Hardship Review process, including the 30-day deadline and the potential consequences of non-compliance. I also prepared a detailed analysis of the Executive Contingency Reserve account, showing exactly how much money had been extracted from our department's budget over the past 4 years. Wednesday morning arrived, and I walked into that conference room with 36 of my former colleagues and 3 company lawyers. The lawyers looked like they hadn't slept in days, and they kept whispering to each other and checking their phones. Our department head wasn't there. Apparently, he'd called in sick. The head lawyer explained that the company had reviewed our requests and wanted to discuss a resolution that would be beneficial for everyone involved. They were prepared to offer enhanced severance packages to avoid the time and expense of a formal financial review process. Each employee would receive 6 months' salary plus benefits continuation, and the company would provide placement services to help everyone find new positions. I listened politely, then asked what they considered enhanced about offering us 6 months when we were legally entitled to a complete financial disclosure if they couldn't prove legitimate hardship. I mentioned that based on my calculations, if the executive contingency reserve had been distributed to employees instead of executives over the past 4 years, each person in our department would have received approximately $43,000 in additional compensation. The lawyers went into another huddle. When they came back, they'd increase the offer to 12 months' salary for each employee, plus extended benefits and a guarantee of positive references. I smiled and said that was generous, but still represented less compensation than we'd have received if our department budget hadn't been systematically transferred to executive bonuses. I suggested they might want to reconsider their position, since we had 24 days remaining before the formal audit began. This went on for 2 hours. Every time they made an offer, I'd politely explain why it didn't adequately address the situation. I never got angry, never made threats, never even raised my voice. I just kept referring back to the company's own policies and the mathematical reality of how much money had been diverted from our budgets to executive compensation. Finally, the head lawyer asked to speak with me privately. We stepped outside the conference room, and he told me very directly that the company was prepared to make this situation go away, but I needed to understand that I was playing a dangerous game. Important people were very unhappy about these filings, and my future employment prospects could be seriously damaged if I continued to push this matter. I looked him straight in the eye and said I appreciated his concern for my career, but I was curious about something. If the company was genuinely experiencing financial hardships severe enough to justify eliminating an entire department, why were they so reluctant to prove it through the audit process their own policies provided? Wouldn't transparent financial disclosure actually support their position and demonstrate responsible corporate governance to shareholders? He stared at me for a long moment, then said he'd need to make some phone calls. The meeting was suspended until the following day. That evening, I got a call from Patricia, the woman who'd been hyperventilating about her new house. She wanted to know what was happening and whether she should get her hopes up. I told her honestly that I didn't know what the company would decide, but I was confident they'd come back with a much better offer the next day. Thursday morning, we reconvened. This time there were 5 lawyers in the room, plus someone from corporate who'd flown in overnight. They had a new proposal. Each affected employee would receive 2 years' salary as severance, plus full benefits continuation for 18 months, plus guaranteed positive references, plus the company would cover all costs associated with job placement services. In return, all employees would sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements and agree not to pursue any further legal action related to their termination. 2 years' salary. For 37 people, that represented millions of dollars in compensation. I looked around the room at my former colleagues, and I could see the relief on their faces. For most of them, this was life-changing money that would give them time to find new jobs without financial pressure. But I wasn't done yet. I asked about the executive contingency reserve account. Would it be discontinued to prevent similar situations in the future? The lawyers exchanged glances and said that was outside the scope of our current discussion. I nodded and said I understood their position. However, I'd noticed that the emergency financial hardship review policy didn't actually allow for settlements that left the underlying financial practices unchanged. The policy was designed to either verify legitimate financial hardship or correct inappropriate financial management that led to unnecessary employee terminations. In other words, taking their money wouldn't stop me from pursuing the audit. The policy required resolution of the systemic financial issues, not just compensation for affected employees. You should have seen their faces. The lawyer who'd threatened my career prospects the day before looked like he was about to have a heart attack. The corporate representative started frantically typing on her phone. Another huddle. This one lasted 15 minutes. When they came back, they had a final offer. 2 years' salary for all employees, full benefits, placement services, and positive references. Plus, the executive contingency reserve account would be dissolved, and all remaining funds would be distributed equally among company employees as a special bonus. Additionally, the company would implement new financial oversight procedures to prevent similar budget diversions in the future. I asked how much was currently in the Executive Contingency Reserve account. $4.7 million. I asked how many total employees the company had. Approximately 800. So in addition to our 2-year severance packages, every employee in the company would receive roughly $6,000, and the executives would lose their secret bonus fund permanently. I looked around the room at my colleagues. Patricia was crying again, but this time from relief. Jerome was grinning like he'd won the lottery. Everyone was nodding at me like I was some kind of hero. But this is where the story takes a turn that nobody in that room saw coming, including me. I said the offer was acceptable for my colleagues, but I had one additional requirement for my own settlement. I wanted something that wasn't about money at all. I told them I wanted complete access to the company's client database, vendor contracts, and operational procedures for 90 days after my termination date. Not to steal anything or violate confidentiality, but to conduct what I called a knowledge transfer assessment to ensure the company could maintain operational efficiency after losing our entire department. The lawyers looked confused. The corporate representative asked why I'd want access to information that had nothing to do with my former position in financial processing. I explained that during my 8 years with the company, I'd noticed inefficiencies and redundancies that were costing significant money. Since they were so concerned about financial constraints, I thought they'd appreciate an opportunity to identify additional cost savings that could prevent future layoffs. I'd provide a comprehensive report documenting my findings, and they could implement or ignore my suggestions as they saw fit. It sounded reasonable, maybe even helpful. The lawyers huddled again, but this conversation was shorter. They agreed to provide me with 90-day consulting access to conduct my operational assessment, with appropriate confidentiality agreements, of course. We shook hands. Paperwork was signed. Within a week, everyone had their settlement agreements and access to their severance payments. The Executive Contingency Reserve was dissolved, and every company employee got their $6,000 bonus. Patricia used her money to pay off her new house completely. Jerome decided to start his own consulting business. Everyone was happy. But here's what none of them knew, and this is where the story gets really interesting. I'd been planning this for 3 years. See, I wasn't just some random financial processor who accidentally discovered executive corruption. I was Helena Hartwell's daughter. Helena Hartwell was one of the original software architects who helped build this company back when it was just 5 people working out of a garage. She wrote most of the core code that the company still uses today, designed the basic operational framework, and created the client management systems that generated billions in revenue over the years. And when the company went public and made the founders incredibly wealthy, they cut her out completely, told her that her contributions had been work for hire, that she had no ownership stake, and that her employment could be terminated at any time. She spent her life savings fighting them in court, but their lawyers buried her in paperwork until she couldn't afford to continue. She died when I was 19, broke and bitter, and convinced that the people she'd helped make rich had stolen everything she'd worked for. I promised myself that someday I'd find a way to balance those scales. So I spent 8 years getting hired by her former company, working my way into a position where I could access their financial records, learning their systems inside and out, and waiting for the right opportunity. The executive bonus fund was just the opening I needed to get inside their decision-making process. But the real target was never the money. It was something much more valuable. During those 90 days of consulting access, I wasn't looking for operational inefficiencies. I was documenting every single piece of intellectual property that my mother had created, every system and process that could be traced back to her original work, and every way the company was still profiting from innovations she'd developed 30 years ago. And I was building something else, a detailed analysis of every major client contract, every vendor relationship, every operational procedure that kept this company running. I was creating a complete blueprint of how to compete with them. Because that was my real plan, not to destroy them with lawsuits or public embarrassment, but to beat them at their own game using the knowledge my mother had given them and they'd stolen from her. 6 months after my termination, I opened Hartwell Systems directly across the street from their main office. I used part of my settlement money as startup capital, but the real advantage was what I'd learned during those 8 years inside their company. I knew exactly which clients were unhappy with their service. I knew which vendors were frustrated with their payment terms. I knew which employees were underpaid and overworked. And I knew every weakness in their operational structure that could be exploited by a smaller, more efficient competitor. My first client was actually one of their biggest accounts, a manufacturing company that had been complaining for years about slow response times and inflexible contract terms. I approached them with a proposal that offered faster service, better support, and significantly lower costs. When they asked how I could afford to undercut the market leader by 30%, I explained that my overhead was lower because I wasn't funding executive bonus schemes. They signed immediately. Within 3 months, I'd hired 12 former employees from my old company, including Patricia and Jerome. People who knew the systems, understood the clients, and were motivated to prove that the financial constraints that had cost them their jobs were actually just corporate greed. Within 6 months, I'd signed 47 new clients, including 16 who'd switched over from my former employer. My old company started scrambling to match my pricing, but they couldn't do it without cutting into their executive compensation packages. That's when things got really fun. Remember those financial oversight procedures they'd agreed to implement? The ones that were supposed to prevent budget diversions like the executive contingency reserve? Well, it turns out that when you're suddenly losing major clients to a competitor who's offering drastically lower prices, the pressure to find new revenue sources becomes intense. I'd anticipated this. In fact, I'd counted on it. I started hearing from former colleagues who were still working there that executives were pushing for creative accounting solutions to maintain profit margins while matching competitor pricing. Budget transfers were happening again, just more carefully hidden this time. So, I did something that probably sounds crazy. I sent them a gift. I had a bouquet of flowers delivered to the CEO's office with a note that said, "Congratulations on your new financial oversight procedures. I'm confident they'll prevent any future budget irregularities." And I signed it, Helena Hartwell's daughter. That's when they realized who I actually was. Suddenly, everything made sense to them. The way I'd known about the executive contingency reserve, the way I'd navigated their legal procedures so smoothly, the way I'd been able to compete with them so effectively right out of the gate. They understood that this wasn't just about revenge for a layoff. This was about settling a debt that was 3 decades old. But here's the thing. By the time they figured it out, it was too late to do anything about it. I'd been careful to stay completely within legal boundaries. Everything I'd done was either explicitly allowed by their own policies or standard competitive business practice. They couldn't sue me for using information I'd legitimately accessed during my employment. They couldn't claim I'd violated my non-disclosure agreement because I hadn't revealed any confidential information publicly. And they couldn't accuse me of unfair competition because offering better service at lower prices is literally what competition is supposed to be. Meanwhile, my business kept growing. More clients, more employees, more market share, and every success felt like honoring my mother's memory in a way that lawsuits never could have. But the real vindication came 18 months after I'd started Hartwell Systems. My former employer's stock price had dropped 40% as investors lost confidence in their ability to compete effectively. 3 of the executives who'd been receiving those bonus payments were terminated for strategic failures. The company had to lay off 2 more departments to cut costs. And this time, there really were legitimate financial constraints. That's when I got a call from their current CEO, a man who'd replaced the previous CEO after the stock price collapse. He wanted to meet with me to discuss a potential partnership opportunity. I agreed to the meeting, mostly out of curiosity. He offered to buy Hartwell Systems for $47 million. I listened to his entire presentation, asked a few clarifying questions about the terms, and then told him I appreciated the offer but wasn't interested in selling. Instead, I made him a counteroffer. Hartwell Systems would be happy to acquire certain operational divisions of his company, particularly those involving the original software architecture and client management systems. We'd be willing to offer fair market value for those assets, along with employment guarantees for affected staff. Essentially, I offered to buy back the parts of the company my mother had helped create. He said he'd need to discuss it with his board of directors. 2 weeks later, he called back with a different proposal. Instead of acquisition, would I be interested in a consulting contract to help them restructure their operations for improved efficiency? They were particularly interested in my insights into cost reduction strategies that didn't require personnel cuts. I told him I'd consider it, but any consulting work would need to include proper attribution for the foundational systems my mother had developed. Historical credit where credit was due. He agreed. So now I have a consulting contract with my mother's former company, helping them fix the problems created by the same executives who'd stolen her work and cut her out of the profits. I'm being paid very well to undo the damage caused by their greed and short-sighted decision-making. And the best part? Every recommendation I make, every improvement I suggest, every cost-saving measure I implement gets documented in reports that explicitly acknowledge Helena Hartwell's contributions to the company's foundational success. Her name is now officially part of their corporate record, and her innovations are finally being credited properly. The executives who betrayed her are gone. The company that tried to erase her legacy now pays her daughter to fix their mistakes. And Helena Hartwell's name is permanently embedded in the corporate history of a billion-dollar company. That's revenge. Not destroying them, but succeeding so completely that they have to acknowledge what they tried to steal. Not bringing them down, but rising so high that they have to look up to see me. Not making them suffer, but making them pay, literally pay, for the wisdom they should have valued from the beginning. My mother died thinking she'd failed, that her work had been stolen and her contributions forgotten, but she'd actually planted seeds that took 30 years to grow. She'd taught me everything I needed to know, not just about software and systems, but about persistence and justice and the long game. The executives who thought they were firing a quiet financial processor had actually awakened Helena Hartwell's daughter. And Helena Hartwell's daughter had spent 8 years learning everything they'd taught her mother, plus everything they'd forgotten they'd taught me. Today, Hartwell Systems has 230 employees, an annual revenue of $86 million. We're consistently rated as one of the best companies to work for in our region, partly because our executives don't have secret bonus funds. And every year, on the anniversary of my mother's death, I send flowers to the original founders who are still alive. The card always says the same thing. Thank you for teaching me what not to do. I want you to do something for me right now. I want you to think about someone who underestimated you, someone who treated you like you didn't matter, someone who thought they could use you and throw you away. Now I want you to imagine what you could accomplish if you spent 8 years learning everything they think they know better than you do. That's your homework. And I want you to tell me in the comments what you're going to do with that knowledge, because I read every single comment and I want to hear your story. Like this video, if you believe that the best revenge is success that can't be ignored, subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who turned the tables on those who underestimated them. And click that bell icon, because next week I'm going to tell you about the woman who discovered her boss was stealing credit for her work and ended up getting him fired from his own family's company. The best revenge isn't getting even. It's getting ahead.